Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry. Good evening. Okay, this was not a mistake, but actually, since morning, we have been having such an interesting sessions that when it became evening, we already completed many sessions, and now there are only 2 sessions left after this. So, कब सुबह से शाम हो गई पता ही नहीं चला. So yeah, such an interesting show put up by Uma Shankarji at this Ahmedabad Literature Festival, 7th edition, 2022. Yeah. Okay, I am Kosha. I am an author. I host a talk show. I am a life enthusiast and a learner. And I'll be hosting this session for today. Okay, the topic for the session is world literature concerns in conserving cultural and natural heritage. So whenever I speak the word heritage, the things that comes to our mind is only national monuments, heritage sites, temples at the most. But there are macro and micro level heritage thing. Like as an individual, for me, heritage will be like my granny handed over a sari to my mom. I will be wearing it and I'll be handing over to my daughter. That will be a heritage for me. Or maybe some vessels of copper and brass which are handed over from generations to generations, or the recipes of the pickles. So as an audience, let's have a little interactive session and tell me like what thing comes to your mind when we talk about heritage. Anyone would like to answer? Yeah. Can you, you'll have to be a little loud. Something very old. Culture, yeah. Okay. Anyone else? Okay. So it's lightly said that it includes cultural and natural heritage, which includes people, clothes, their habits, their food, their clothing, even their language. Like I am from Saurashtra, so my Kathiawadi language is an accent. Yes, ma'am, you want to speak something? All right, yeah. So even that is a heritage for us, right? When we speak, we tell that Kathiawadi accent. In Gujarati, we call it Kathiawadi lehko. So, જ્યારે અમે લોકો બોલીએ છીએ ત્યારે કાઠિયાવાડી લહેકો આવી જ જાય છે. So that is even a heritage. Cultural heritage includes all this tangible as well as intangible things, and natural heritage includes forests, rivers, rural landscapes, mountains, everything which we all know that we should not spoil it and conserve it. How? By not spoiling it, keeping it clean, by talking to the people and everything. Yeah. When I talk about Italy, the first word that comes to the mind is pizza, right? So there are people, 3,000 people, who are taking this culture of baking pizza. They are teaching it. They have a festival every year for learning this. Like Patoda, Patanna, Sankheda, all this is heritage. And today's panelists, I would like to call upon, first of all, I would like to call upon Emmanuel Bottiau, who is director of Alliance Francasia Ahmedabad. He has done his major in English literature and culture from Paris. He was a linguistic attaché at the French embassy in Nigeria as the director of Alliance Francasia. He has worked in numerous countries, and he has been supervisor of the Alliance Francasia in England, Scotland, and currently he is director at Alliance Ahmedabad. His experience as an English as a second language teacher in Paris is also noteworthy. His areas of interest includes literature and fantasy. Apart from that, he is also passionate about contemporary art and electronic music. Welcome, sir. The next panelist, I would like to invite on the stage Kathryn Hummel, who is an Australian writer, mixed media artist, and multidisciplinary researcher. She's authored 6 books of poems, and her latest is Lemon Lement Willett 2019. A widely traveled performance poet and artist in residence, her writing across genres has been published, performed, translated, and anthologized worldwide. Recipient of the NEC Essay Writing Competition Prize, the Melbourne Lord Mayor's Dorothy Potter Award, and Copyright Agency Ltd's Best Poetry Prize, and she has also been nominated for Futser Prize, among others. Welcome, ma'am. The next panelist is Alison Reilly, who is Deputy Consul General, Ireland, Mumbai. She studied sociology and history in the University College and has masters in sociology of development. She's worked in the area of local development and social, including many years in Ireland. And right now she is joined in the Department of Foreign Affairs and does many works to strengthen the bilateral relation between Ireland and India. I didn't notice. Yeah, and the last but not least panelist, Dr. Nitin Sarkar Pillai, who is Assistant Professor of Communication at the Nirma Institute of Management, Nirma University. He has been teaching experience in the domain of communication, and his personal focus is in assisting students develop their communicative competence for strategic, personal, and professional interactions. Right. He has done masters in philosophy in English language, teaching and higher order thinking skills. He's awarded a PhD for his work in alternative language assessment strategies that investigated the need for better assessment practices in order to develop communicative abilities. He is trained in language assessment and critical thinking. Okay, from USA. And he has been awarded for his outstanding contribution to education by the Indian Council of Literary, Social Education and Cultural Research, and is recipient of Justice Ibrahim Sheikh Award, Srimati Shardaben Kharawala Gold Medal for Excellence in Education. And he has been invited as a resource person for various faculty development programs for English language, organized by Gujarat University, and e-commerce development in the form of MOOCs, and has conducted various training programs for teachers of languages. He writes on different topics of communication at his blog. Welcome, sir. Yeah. And last, I would like to welcome the moderator of this session, Janvi, who is a journalist and has experience in working Divya Bhaskar, Gujarat Samachar, and Times of India.
Welcome all the panelists, and we hope to have a wonderful session here. I'll try to ask as interesting questions as I can, but at the end of the session, if you have any questions, please be ready with it. To start with, I'll just clarify the topic again for all of you or any of you who has not understood the topic. We are going to discuss about the role of literature. Any literature, Australian literature, French literature, Gujarati literature, any literature in conserving our natural and cultural heritage. And we'll be discussing with the panelists on this topic. Just wanted to make the topic clear. To start with, and I'll be keeping this forum open, any of you who would want to answer can pick up. There's no like giving you 2 minutes to speak, giving you 10 minutes to speak, not that. So to start with, just wanted, we are here, people are from different backgrounds, people from French background, people from Australian backgrounds, people from Indian background. Just wanted to say that how is nature or culture referred in your literature? If you would want to give the audience a brief idea about that, because not all of them would have read about world literature here. Yeah, any of you can start.
Hello, is this on? Great. Yeah. Yes, I'm from a city called Adelaide in Australia. And for many years, I wasn't very engaged in Australian literature. I think I was always looking elsewhere. certainly in South Asia, so Bangladesh and of course India. But Australian literature is very interesting in terms of this topic because, of course, Australia was colonized by largely the British, I guess you'd say. And in doing so, it kind of set up the colonization of Australia, of course, disrupted First Nations cultures of Australia, it's a very dark history to bear. And of course, First Nation cultures had their own literature, but it was not written down. It was an oral history passed to,
Verbally
within
maybe.
groups. So when the white settlers came to Australia, of course, they imposed their own culture on various aspects, on the environment, on economics, on health, on all of these things, including literature. So Australian literature, of course, there's a vast unmapped territory in Australian literature. Then there is the white settler literature. And this is people known as the bush balladeers, people like Henry Lawson, Banjo Patterson. So if you ever study Australian literature, these are the names that would probably come up as, the first Australian poets, for example. And they did write about the environment and evoked the environment and often drew comparisons between urban spaces and what Australians called the bush, which is essentially the forest, and of course includes the desert and the very vast differences of landscapes in Australia, which of course India has as well. And I was reading an essay by an Australian poet, Caitlin Marling, where she writes about Australian colonization, and she says that when English came to Australia, it was very difficult because often there was no language to describe Australia. Like English, of course, described an English landscape, but when it came to coming to Australia, it became described in a foreign language, essentially, not the languages of the people, of course, whose land it was originally. And this is very evident in the poetry of these white settler poets, the bush balladeers. And of course, in recent times, there has been a great upsurgence, and rightly so, of First Nations writers who are, to some extent, reclaiming their right to speak about their country and the very spiritual and organic ties they have to the land, because of course identity in a lot of First Nations cultures in Australia is tied to the land. So this is coming out in contemporary Australian literature. So we see this kind of, I wouldn't say decolonization, but certainly an acknowledgement of the poets of Australia, who of course were the First Nations people.
I think more ways than one we share the history. Like even India was colonized, and we have a similar sort of literature, so can totally relate to that. Anyone else?
Well, I obviously have hello everyone, sorry. I obviously come from a different background, coming from France, having been, not proud to say it, but a colonial power, so that's a different perspective. When considering the topic of nature as represented in French literature, I think it somehow fits a lot of stereotypes about French culture as being a very romantic country. And I started digging into my childhood memories when I was at school, and literature is a very important part of our curriculum in France. And the only thing I remembered was this 17th and 18th century literature, mostly written by noble men and noble women, because they were the only ones who could actually read and write. And it was all about the domestication of nature, how great man was in his ability to tame nature and make it as convenient and beautiful as he or she wanted it to be. Things started changing somehow in the 18th century with French philosophers like Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is one of the most recognized French philosophers that came up with this concept that is quite familiar to many people of the state of nature and the state of nurture. And I think that's some kind of a turning point in French literature. We are somehow drifting away from this romantic perception of nature, you know, just being pretty and domesticated, to the basis of a real concern about the impact of man on nature. And later on, with Romanticism, there was another kind of connection between man and nature that we could see, especially in poetry, with poets like Charles Baudelaire, that endowed nature with a soul, and there was some sort of communication between the soul of nature and the human soul. And that's it for France, because as far as contemporary literature is concerned, I'm quite sad to say that you know, having majored in English and American literature, there is way more to find in that respect than in French literature, which is still about society, still about the people. And if there's any storyline about the relationship between man and nature, it's only in the background. And if I have to answer all the questions about this relationship between man and nature, I would have to dig into British literature or American literature rather than French literature.
Thank you for sharing your side of the story, where you're talking about the relation between men and nature. And on these lines, I would also want to add about Gujarati verbal literature, because I have that background. And I remember singing this as a child, like, Avare varshat, dhebariyo parshat, uni uni rotli ne karelanu shak. Well, this is something we used to sing as children to just welcome rain. Then we had another such a thing, કે ચક્કી બેન મારી સાથે જમવા આવજો કે નહીં. Like, here we're talking about sparrows, we're talking about rain, we talk about worshipping trees, and most of this literature is verbal literature. So I think here we can also talk about written literature, verbal literature, something which is passed on to us from one generation to another. Yeah. Anyone else who would want to?
If I may. So Irish, again, we were a colony. So we were colonized by the British 800, 900 odd years ago. So they had, well, by the English, but they had a huge influence on us. But before that, we had an oral literature, an oral tradition. And many of our great oral stories, and especially our mythology, placed everyone in their locality, their nearest stream, their nearest mountain, their nearest valley. Everywhere in the landscape had a name. And I think that sense of, still in Ireland, people are very rooted to the place where they're from, and naming every hill, every field is still very much part of the culture, and that really places you in your environment. And but moving on from them, when I first read about the topic's title, it was poetry that came to mind, and also how our poets, when it came to advocating for getting rid of the colonial powers, they really romanticized the landscape and nature, and it was our love of the land that was used as a motivator to try and expel these colonizers. And this went on for the last few hundred years. It wasn't just with Yeats and whoever nowadays, but it was that if you are at one with where you live, you must want to expel these people who don't love the place like you do, who don't essentially worship it like you do. I mean, there was a tradition even within Christianity in Ireland of recognizing, worshipping water, etc., but also recognizing God in nature, and that was something that really protected the environment. We also had a lot of stories about what bad things fairies, etc., would do to us if we didn't protect the environment. But that long tradition of respecting the environment and of being very sure of where you were placed in the world, that's very strong in our literature.
Interesting. Yeah. Sir, you would like to add?
Hi everyone. So, having heard from the other three panelists, what I can see is that there's a lot of universality in what we are speaking about, because we're talking about poems as the first go-to place as far as nature is concerned. And secondly, all of you talk about colonialism as a place where it came up in the forefront. But for India, it came way before that. We're talking about the Tamil poets in the Sangam era who wrote something called the Pattu Pattu. So basically it was 10 songs. And in that what they're doing is they are not talking about nature as a separate entity ever. It's somehow so interwoven with the way that we live that it becomes a soft influence on what human beings do and what human beings are doing to nature. So there was a reverence with which nature was looked at. And if there was an irreverence, there was a reciprocation to that. And this started way back in the Sangam era, where the first structured poetry of Tolkapian came into being. So from the oral tradition, when we went into written also, we are talking about a nature that is a force to reckon with, but it has to be carefully dealt with, because it is all-powerful without it being all-powerful. So that subtlety was something that defined the poetry and the way that nature is seen at that particular time. Just to give an idea of how this was done and I'm giving a very rough translation here of a Tamil poetry. It says, "Their love for us is great and they just can't bear it. Friend, those fruit-shedding hills of his will weep waterfalls of tears." So every comparison that is being made of a human emotion is reflected in nature. And this was way back in the Sangam era. So even at that time, we were talking about a reverence to nature and how it reciprocates back into human experiences. So that, I think, is universal across the world in terms of literature.
Thank you for beautifully weaving in South Indian literature into this forum. Well, to just talk about the impact of literature on nature and cultural heritage, I would just like to refer to Rudyard Kipling. Like, he was a British author, and I think that his literature, specifically the Jungle Book, is something that we have read even, or like kids, even in remote areas of India have read, loved, and they've learnt about nature through this literature. So this was just a reference, but if you would like to elaborate on how literature has played a role in impacting people's perception towards nature or even in conserving nature, any of you?
I think I'll start. I mean, it's going this way.
That wasn't a tough question.
So again, this concept of there's a dichotomy in the way that we look at nature. So a lot of literature is written where we are in awe of nature, right? Nature is something that we look up to from a point of view of religion, of worshipping and all. And then there is this absolute cavalier nature that we have towards, a perception towards nature, which gets back to us. So you have a lot of post-apocalyptic literature that has come from across the world, and not just recently, from time immemorial, where even in 1902 people are writing about what would happen if you don't take care of nature. So I think to answer your question, nature is being looked at, and human beings are being told, take care or else. And since people have started writing, and since world literatures have become more popular, everybody is talking about that. Everybody is talking about take care of nature, otherwise there's doomsday. That's right there. And it is then left up to the humans to select which one we want to take up. Do we want to take up the one where we have this reverence, or we have this irreverence towards nature? It depends on how we took it.
I suppose when it comes to the influence of literature on my love of nature and heritage, and I was inspired by listening to, well, what I could understand of the session beforehand, I suddenly started remembering all the children's literature that I had loved that involved the characters developing a love of nature, whether it was the wild, like finding out what fruits to eat, what nuts to eat, whatever, living, camping wild in nature, things like that, or just nature landscape presented as somewhere to feel fully human. That in the wilds of a landscape, that's when you can be most in touch with who you are as a person. Kind of a meditative space, nearly, wild open spaces. And in Ireland, we're a bit obsessed with the sea. We're an island nation, huge coastline, and the sea is all powerful. The Atlantic Ocean is pounding against our shores. It is providing food, but it's also always, at any moment, it can turn not against you, but it just shows how insignificant you are. And I suppose for me, the influence of literature, whether children's or adults or whatever, is not that you are threatened by nature and we better, sort ourselves out. It's that it helped to grow my love of nature, and therefore, of course, I want to look after and cherish something that I've enjoyed and love. Why wouldn't I want my natural heritage to continue on? Because it's something that's brought me so much joy. It's not, I don't feel that it's a sort of a threat, that looking after nature is a joy and that we should all be sharing. Sorry, I'm a terrible romantic.
Alison, just to add to what you were saying, I mean, it's just so meditative to listen to you. I mean, just yes, please.
I'll carry on a probably less contemplative and positive note with the connection between conserving our natural heritage and literature. What struck me most in modern literature is how popular the dystopian genre is developing, and you were referring to it as sending the readers a very strong message as to what could happen in the near future if we don't act now. And once more, there are many examples to be taken from English-speaking literature. I'm thinking about The Handmaid's Tale, for example, where you've got this very interesting part where nature has its revenge on humankind, because humans have been overexploiting natural resources, and now the whole world is suffering from toxic waste, etc., which makes people infertile. So it's like, it's nature's revenge on humankind for mistreating it throughout the years. And there's also this specific genre that is called cli-fi, climate fiction. Thinking about an English book called The Carbon Diaries that shares a vision of a world where, well, most natural resources are extinct, and that people have to survive and, sort of manage with drastic restrictions that challenges their ways of lives and even their survivals. So that's how conserving the human heritage resonates with me in terms of contemporary literature.
The Carbon Diaries, that's the book you mentioned, right? I mean, for all the people who haven't read the book, I think that's the book we can refer to for learning more about natural heritage, right? Yeah. You want to?
Yes, I opted to go last because I was very interested in everyone's responses. And I would say I would agree with, or definitely, Nitin, I think you're right. I think, if you're talking about literature in response to nature or the environment, it would fall into people who observe nature, like writers who observe nature, or writers who engage in some kind of environmental activism, or again, writers who are in a sense of awe, traditionally. But of course, you can probably add the dystopian response as well. And I would probably, in contemporary literature, and not only in Australia, I would say there is a move towards the Anthropocene as well. So looking, like you were saying, Alison, looking at yourself not as separate to nature, but as like a species that is, part of the world's ecosystem. And so again, with this dynamic our connection to nature isn't just as someone, as you know, a realm of beings who is higher than nature, but actually actively involved in nature. And I think as the human race has progressed, of course, civilization has, we tend to cut ourselves off from that. But when it comes to literature's role in impacting our conservation, I think it's very because less and less people are reading these days. And so I don't know how great the role of literature is into, you know, creating awareness of this. We would go back and read, say, the English Romantic poets or something like that, or
I would just want to add to your point that you said that people are reading less, but I think the forms of reading have changed. Like maybe we are reading more on like online platforms, or we are reading more through OTT platforms. I think the way we consume literature has changed.
I don't know. Well, I'm just speaking from my own experience as a professor. I'm always wanting to get my students to read, and they're saying, "Have you done your homework?" And I'm like, no. But yes, I mean, I think that's a very good point. But in terms of, I mean, I know, say again, going back to Australia, there is an organization called Red Room Poetry based in Sydney, and they run various programs, again, probably for children and young adults, not so much high school students. But I think that is a very good point. And they run programs like, I think it's called New Shoots, where they get participants to write about nature, to, you know, they collaborate with Botanical Gardens of Sydney and so on, so that the young writers are actually responding to nature very early, and it is around issues like conservation of nature. So I think probably like a social literary programs like that are very, very more impactful than simply putting a book out there and expecting only those interested in reading to come to it. It's kind of like preaching to the converted, if you like.
So even the writers will have to put in more efforts.
I think we have to find ways of responding to the zeitgeist. I mean, Handmaid's Tale was an amazingly successful series, wasn't it? So I think, yeah, like literary adaptations and so on could be a very good way of doing that.
Yeah, yes, please.
And I sadly agree with you, Kathryn. The younger generation tend to read less and less. We live in a society where mostly everything has to be visual. And when it comes to something as crucial as preserving our natural heritage, I tend to believe that other forms of art besides literature are way more impactful. I'm just thinking about Banksy, for example.
Yeah. And the wall art.
Yeah, and his Monet's show me the money, that is the pun, and it's based on the water lilies by Claude Monet, but then you see a traffic cone and a shopping cart, and it's just a reflection on how we're handling nature and the outcome of this insane consumer society we live in. And having used that with my students when I was a teacher, there was no quote I could have given from any author that would have made 10% of the impact this work by Banksy had on them. It's pretty sad, but that's the reality of the world we live in. And street art, being, out of the museum, out of anything academic, resonating with the passerby, the man or the woman on the street, and most importantly, being accessible on social media. Literature and social media are not as impactful of any form of visual art. So that's sad, but that's a reality when we're talking about raising awareness on the importance of preserving our natural heritage.
You rightly talked about like importance of wall art, and I think the only wall art we see in Ahmedabad in Gujarat is symbols of political parties. That's all we are getting.
There's a lament that all teachers have, including me, that students are not reading anymore, right? And then how do you get them to talk about nature and where humans come into play in this? But then I believe that we are consuming literature in a different form. Just to give you two examples where nature, where humans and nature have interacted with Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park. These two, these two works of literature are talking about man playing God, with that abstraction in mind, right? It does give us an impact of what happens when you mess around with the natural order of things and what it can lead to. Now, these two books, for those who are literature lovers, Frankenstein still remains the best horror genre to go to. But for the younger generation, probably they have seen a knockoff version of that book in the form of a movie, but it gets them to talk about what is the role of man in nature. And the same thing happens with Jurassic Park also. I mean, if you look at it, what we are doing is we are messing around with with gene splicing and all. We are messing around with the natural order of things. And students do tend to see that, just even for the sake of watching it. But it's a good way to start the conversation on where do we want, what role do we want us to play in the future with this. So yes, we are consuming in a different way. We are consuming from different sources, but it, I think, aligns with what we are talking about here. Where do we want the discussion to go?
Here I would also want to add that literature is so powerful that instead of just preserving our cultural heritage, literature can create heritage. To just give an example, that's something like Harry Potter. Harry Potter is a fictional character, but now we have Harry Potter's traditional railway station built in Scotland. Romeo and Juliet, it's a fictional character, but now in Europe, we have places where you can actually write a letter to Juliet. Even sitting in India, I can post a letter to Juliet. So, I mean, it's just interesting that how powerful literature is, that an author sitting alone, maybe somewhere in library, writing a character, and now people are following it, and there are real, actual places, you know, which are built based on that literature. Yeah. Coming to the next question, I would really want to know that, as you rightly said, that human beings are a small subset of nature. And talking of my personal understanding of human beings, I have understood human beings through the literature of Ayn Rand, especially through Fountainhead. I've understood the resilience of human beings, the power of human beings, and how a small, timid human being can be so powerful in adverse circumstances. Or I've understood literature through Sapiens. So I would want to know from each of you that what's that one piece of literature that has really impacted you? And I think this will also help audience to just maybe pick up another interesting book or consume a little bit of literature which is really, really worth it. Yeah, anything that, you know, has really impacted you as a person. Again, not a
I think the difficulty is narrowing it down to one only.
yeah, just one piece of literature. Right?
Does it have to do with nature? Because I would say, I mean, I am a writer, but I don't necessarily, I write a lot of, I would say, urban pieces more than anything. Not to say that urban ecology isn't something on theme, but...
keeping the ground open, I mean, you can choose anyone, yeah.
I think I was talking to a friend of mine. I ordered him a book by a writer who had a very big impact on me, and her name was Rosamund Lehman, and she was a writer in 1920s, English writer, who, when her first novel came out, when she was in her 20s, very young, it was reviewed as the kind of novel that Keats would have written. And what I find, I read about her work before I actually read her work. I wasn't able to access it. This was back in the day before Amazon and so on, when I was at university. So I went to the Bar Smith Library at the University of Adelaide and immediately started reading her work. And I think now, you know, about 20 years later, still has an impact on my writing, and I still refer to her books because, I mean, she was never as popular as, say, Virginia Woolf, who was writing at the time, and of course was very groundbreaking and experimental in her style.
Still so popular.
Yeah, and but Rosamund Lehman was, she was a humanist. Like the way that she could write about emotional life was incredible, and still very contemporary. And I wish she were read more. But she's had, I mean, I'm predominantly known as a poet, but I do write short fiction as
But
well.
how has it impacted you as a person?
Yeah, I guess I'm getting to that. Yes, rather than just telling you about how has it impacted me, I think it's made me more aware. I mean, as a poet, I think, I'm sure a lot of people in the audience write poetry. You would say that a poem is a response to an emotional event. It's about observation and self-observation, and not only that, but about communion with an unknown reader. You want for someone to, if not see what you are, or perceive what you are writing, or interpret the way you are writing it, but certainly feel something when they read your words. Anything, it could be disgust even, or ridicule, as well as, yes, I understand what that person, the empathy, I understand what that person was feeling, and I know I'm kind of running on here, sorry. So yes, so Rosamund Lehman, even though she didn't write poetry, I think she made me aware of the vast ocean of feelings to be somehow captured within my own creative practice.
I think literature can make you empathetic, and I think that's the real power of.
Yes, but I'm full of admiration for people who can do it as precisely and beautifully as she was writing.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes, please.
Well, I tried very, very hard to name a French author, because the first that came to mind were either English or American. But then when I found the author, the French author, I think even though if it's not the first that came to mind, he's the one that has had the strongest personal impact on me. And that would be the poet I mentioned before, Charles Baudelaire, who wrote The Flowers of Evil. And it's funny that I would pick a poet, because I don't read poetry, to be honest. But it's The Flowers of Evil have always traveled around with me. I always carry a copy with me. I've been around the world, and I always have a copy of The Flowers of Evil with me. And the reason why I picked it, it's pretty similar to what you said. It's about the human feelings. It's things that you're aware of, but you don't know how to express. And the poet has that way with words, and uses the violence of language to express those feelings that you have, but you cannot put words on it. And when it comes to Charles Baudelaire, it's also about the feast of the senses. And I realized this is how I live my life. I try to find beauty wherever I can, in nature, in humans as well, in everything that surrounds me, and it has to be a feast of the senses. And this very poet, that I really encourage you to read, if you've not done so, has this very peculiar way of having the sense of smell and the eyesight and the taste. It's like you can taste, see, hear everything at once, and it's just magical.
Yeah, it's beautiful how everything just sums up to feelings and being a better human being. Yeah. Anyone else?
So for me, the book that would have spoken to me at a different level was Galapagos by Von Gutt, because it has a line saying that the greatest evil of all time, the greatest villain of all time is the human brain. Because that book talks about how human beings have destroyed the earth, and then a new generation of semi-seal-like creatures are populating. So again, this part of me, which I come back to again, that not taking care of nature kind of scares me. I think it is deep-rooted in that particular book, which really moved me to think about. And this is not a recent book. It's not a recent one. It's an old book which has stood the test of time. So that really spoke to me.
Interesting. It's just beautiful how few lines of a book or a paragraph of a book can really inspire you. To just give you a personal example, for me, it's just about like two roads diverge in the wood, and I took the one less traveled, and that made all the difference. I think I go back to these lines time and again because it becomes like a guiding light in my life. And I think it's for all of us that literature has the power, it has the influence to guide you. And on this note, I'll keep this forum open for people. If you have any questions, we are here to talk about world literature. People who are representing world literature are here. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Theme of conservation or doomsday. But what about literature using this theme in the background? I mean, simply a description of the hills of a particular place. I've recently been reading a lot of books where Wales is the background, or the Cotswolds are the background. And simply reading about that in the background makes one feel that this is a beautiful place. It should be kept the way it is. It should not be damaged. So what is your take on this direct versus indirect?
For the indirect one, ma'am, I'd be able to answer that. Again, going back to ancient literature, Tamil literature per se, it would always categorize, if there was an interaction between lovers, it would always categorize it in 4 landscapes. So you would have the mountains in this kind of literature where the clandestine meetings between lovers would happen. It gives them hooks and corners to hide in. If the separation was for a very long period, the background would always be the sea. Because the vastness does resonate with that. If they had challenges in meeting, but it was very short period for this, generally it would be either a bucolic pasture or probably a forest where this encounter would happen. And you would see that the same thing happens in the Ramayana also. The 14 years of Vanvas also happens in the forest because it has this. And if they had to show jealousy, it would always be the scorching earth. The background would always be there. And that is something that happens even recently. So whatever Perumal is writing right now has the same kind of thing. It's just that nature works in the background and it just helps set the tone for it. And probably that was an indirect way of influencing us to start thinking on those lines, to associate this. The same thing I've seen in one of the books by, it's called Chemmin. It's a Malayalam book. It's written by Thagaji Shivashankar Pillai. The setting is the sea, because the title means shrimp, and it talks about forlorn lovers who are unable to meet each other. And again, the sea talks about that. So I think very subtly these writers have always brought it in for people to understand. And I think probably that was an indirect way of showing it.
To just add to what you said, that you said that many a times nature is just in the backdrop, not as the central theme. But I would want to say that what is nature? I think it's not just about mountains and sun. And someone has rightly said that we, and whatever our extension is, like this table or chair or this stage, everything is nature. If you can't find God, or if you can't find nature, say on your computer or on this chair, then I don't think we can find nature on mountains, or we can find nature on the top of a mountain. So I think it really depends on what our idea of nature is.
Thank you. I have a question to Mr. Emmanuel. Yeah. First of all, congratulations. Author from your country has got Nobel for literature a few days back. I believe it was declared yesterday or day before yesterday. And you have studied American literature. A very generic question. What is the basic difference between American literature and the French literature?
Straightforwardness, I would say. That's a trick question. Wow, what am I going to say? French literature is Well, American literature is a literature of people from the New World. So it's a more recent civilization. It would be the same thing as asking what is the difference between British English and American English. It's this straightforwardness, this sense of efficiency, you know. When you think about French literature, you think about fancy words, fancy settings, fancy stories. You can think about les liaisons dangereuses, dangerous liaisons, you know, a very sophisticated, intellectual literature. American literature would be the literature of the people, you know, and not tackling less interesting or less deep topics, but just in somehow a more universal and effective way. And I'm feeling sorry for saying that because I'm supposed to promote French literature. Yeah, French literature is all about beauty. Not always about being efficient in reaching as many people as possible. Things are changing with contemporary literature. Really, the Nobel Prize of Literature, which I'm proud to say is French, is the exact opposite of what I've just described in terms of talking to the people and to everyone. So yeah, that's how I would answer that question.
Thank you.
Thank you. I guess this is a wonderful session, but we are really running a little short of time. I know you all have so many questions, but these people are really available and they'll be happy to answer your questions off the stage. Am I right, sir? I'm sorry. Yeah.
Mean that the environment and the natural heritage outside of cities isn't a character in urban literature still. There are still moments where characters, when we were talking about direct and indirect, contemporary urban-based literature tends to be that overt messaging, whereas literature that's set in a rural landscape, I think, does take on that slower pace, or the stereotypical slower pace of rural life, and therefore the messages are a little bit more relaxed. They're embedded in the whole story, so you subtly engage with them. And just since you mentioned folklore, we're having a bit of a revival in our mythology in Ireland, well, over the last couple of decades, but really now, when it comes to comics, actually, it's become a big gateway into our previous literature in mythology. But I think our mythology is so rooted in environment, and now that mythology has been brought into urban stories. So these gods and heroes are given these urban settings now, but they still have the characteristics of the natural phenomenon that they were associated with. And I'm totally digressing, and I'm going to stop.
All right. It was an interesting session. I guess when Janvi said that literature makes us better human, I would like to add that our first piece of literature that we hear is the lullaby from our parents. And the first piece of literature that we create is on the floors or the walls of our home as a child with the crayons or the chalk piece on the, yeah. I'm sure you still want them to keep talking, but as we have another session, I would like Uma Shankar, the founder of this literature festival, to please come on the stage and felicitate all our speakers. Once again, thank you speakers, all of you, Janvi, for moderating this session beautifully. This 7th Ahmedabad International Literature Festival. Audience, please, we still have another interesting sessions. One is recital of poems in different languages, and one is for the Gujarati authors, Gujarati books. So kindly sit there and enjoy the other two sessions as well.